Good morning, good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to this webinar on what's new on the circular economy in cities and regions and how to measure circularity. It's my pleasure to welcome you and to moderate this hour and a half. My name is Aziza Akmouche. I work at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where I head the division on cities, urban policies, and sustainable development, where the work on circular economy in cities and regions is located. My pleasure with the OECD team to welcome you all and to kick off this interesting discussion. I'm with my colleague Oriana Romano, that all of you know. Oriana is the architect of this work on circular economy. She's heading the program in my team at the OECD, and her two colleagues, Ander and Luis. Thank you both for the great work and for helping us throughout this hour and a half. A bit of background as an introduction, and in particular for those of you that were not in the first webinar that we held this morning with over 250 participants. You may be aware that today in Oslo, we were supposed to hold the second meeting of the OECD Roundtable on circular economy in cities and regions in the face of this very specific COVID-19 context. We have decided with our colleagues from the city of Oslo and Nordic Innovation, whom I thank very much for the great work, to postpone the meeting, the physical meeting of the roundtable to fall. But we thought it was a very nice momentum, given many of your agendas were actually blocked for this major gathering, to keep the conversation going and to hold these webinars that primarily aim to foster a discussion, a conversation around some of the messages that have come out of our work, working with dozens and dozens of cities, regions, and countries over the past year and a half. This morning, we had a 2-hour webinar, as I said, with over 250 participants to launch the 3 new OECD reports on circular economy in Umeå, Sweden, in Groningen in the Netherlands, and in Valladolid, Spain. We also learned from ongoing policy dialogues with other cities and countries, and in particular, the city of Granada in Spain, the city of Glasgow in the UK, and Ireland at national level. And we also had the pleasure to get some insights from our colleagues from Nordic countries about the Nordic specifics in this transition from linear to circular economy. The webinar went perfectly well. I think we managed to have a very lively discussion. I hope we will have a similar opportunity to mix a number of presentations, very short ones. They will definitely not do justice to the magnitude of the work done in the different places that will be sharing their insights, and also the opportunity to take some questions from the floor. And it's very important that you do this throughout the meeting. There is a colleague who is monitoring the chat, so whenever you hear a presentation, you have something real time to ask, please do so via the chat, and we will have 2-3 moments during the hour and a half where we'll pick some of the questions, we'll revert back to the speakers, and we hope this will be the beginning of a conversation. The webinar is recorded. You will receive the full link after the meeting, alongside with the list of participants. All the PowerPoint presentations will also be sent by email, so you know how to access the background material, as well as the links to the reports that we launched a few hours ago as OECD Secretariat. As it was said by our IT colleague, everybody by default will be on mute. We will collect your insights via the chat. Only the speakers will be unmuted at some point to make their presentations. We are controlling the slides from the OECD Secretariat, so Mia is very effectively helping us through an aggregated presentation. Don't worry if there's a slight delay between the moment speakers years. You said next, and the next slide actually shows on the screen. This is under control. It should fly pretty well. Just a word of introduction, and I will now hand the floor to Oriana to take us through some of the insights of this unique survey that she has been carrying out with her team on circular economy in cities and regions, to say that in the current context, which, as we said this morning, those are unprecedented times, we very much believe that the topic of circular economy will be all the more relevant in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis, when basically all the cities and all the regions will be somehow urged to reconsider the link between environment and health, to reflect further on the dematerialization of the economy and society that we need, the radical transformation of the way we consume, we produce, to reflect on circular resources loops in response to this hyper-globalization of the recent years. And we hope that this webinar series and the roundtable, when it reconvenes physically, will continue to provide opportunities, evidence, recommendations that can make this circular economy part of the solution towards healthier, less resource wasteful, and more environmental aware societies. So we look forward to the discussion. I hope this will provide a nice food for thought for your individual and collective initiatives in this area. I'm pretty sure we're going to have an exciting debate ahead, and I thank in advance all the speakers that we have lined up for this webinar, for your time, for your energy, for your generosity, sharing your experience. Many of you are actually pioneers in this field from both academic and policy environments, and I'm pretty sure this will be a great learning experience for all. I will now hand over the floor to Oriana. Oriana to share with us some of her messages from the survey that she has been leading on circular economy in cities and regions. And then we will have a panel discussion that will open up to new and less new sometimes initiatives on the measurement front in particular. And as a reminder, please send your questions through the chat on a regular basis. You can also follow us on Twitter at OECD_local throughout the webinar. And thank you very much for your patience and your presence. Oriana, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Aziza. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
So thank you very much all for participating in this webinar. Mia, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. I have 10 minutes to present some preliminary results of the OECD survey on the circular economy in cities and regions, and also to share a few ideas on what we call the OECD scoreboard on the circular economy in cities and regions as one of the most challenging tasks for cities and regions is to measure where they are in terms of circularity, what they can do to improve, and how they can have a global and clear picture of what are the actions they should take. I would like just to mention, following the reference that Aziza just made to the situation we are all living in relation to the COVID-19, that of course we have started together with our colleagues and experts to talk about the transition and changes and innovation, change the way we work, the way we consume, and the way we produce. And this situation probably allows us to reflect even further on what would be the actions that we should take after this outbreak and after this crisis. But now let's move on to the description of the preliminary survey. Mia, you can go to the next slides, please. So this is just to give you a little bit of background on what the OECD program on the circular economy in cities and regions is about, and why we started 2 years ago to focus on cities. This is just to recall a bit the mega trends we are living beyond these contingent situations of these days. We identified 4 main mega trends on the fact that by 2050 the population will grow and 70% of the population will be living in cities. We know that by 2030, $6.7 trillion per year will be needed in investment in infrastructure, including for water, for energy, for waste, for transport, all sectors that are involved in the circular economy discourse. And we know that the availability and quality of natural resources in some cases throughout the globe is at risk, and this is also due to the effect of the climate change. Now, the way we see the circular economy, of course, we see it as an opportunity. The fact that we are talking about the circular economy now, these days, and in the last few years as one of the major topic very high on the political agendas of different cities and regions, as well as national government, is that the circular economy sees not only as an opportunity to contribute to lowering carbon emissions. Of course, also, this is one of the aim of circular economy related programs, projects and actions. But if we are talking about an economic system that is able to create jobs, that is able to have a potential economic growth. Some studies have calculated on up to $4.5 trillion by 2030. So we, as an international and economic organization, we would like to, and we are supporting cities and regions in the transition towards this circular economy by developing circular economy strategies and helping the implementation through peer learning and learning by doing, as it was highlighted this morning. We do this by looking in particular at 3 main dimensions that we call people, policies, and places, because we think that the circular economy, first of all, is a shared responsibilities across levels of government, businesses, and citizens, so a wide range of stakeholders. We are looking at the policies because it's not only about waste we are talking about, but a systemic approach across several policies, like in relation to water, to energy, to transport, and so on. And we're also looking at places because it is important to consider the scale at which these actions should be taken and implemented. And also it's important to look at the relation across the urban and rural areas. When we look at the drivers, if we can go to the next slide, this is basically the mapping of the survey for which I'm sharing some result. We have cities and region, 37 from Europe, America, 6 from America, 2 from Oceania, and 1 from Asia, in addition to the 6 case studies that they were presenting this morning. Next slide, please. In which we can see that basically when we asked cities and respondents to the questionnaire to identify the word out of 50 that we proposed on what they are reminded when they think about the circular economy, one of the 3 main points are climate change, innovation, and waste management. In fact, if we go to the next slide, you can see actually the numbers in terms of the drivers for which the climate change, merging the responses for the drivers as a very relevant is really the first and foremost, most important driver for going circular, followed by global agenda and economic change. I want to just raise your attention on one more point in relation to the drivers, is that if we take into account both the responses to very relevant and relevant, research and development, technical development, as well as new business models are the very important driver for this transition. Please, next slide. So what do cities and regions do? There are several circular economy initiatives that are flourishing. When we did this survey across 43 cities and 3 regions, we identified 25 initiatives on the circular economy in cities and 17 in development. Most of these circular economy initiatives are related to different sectors, such as waste for 76%, building sector 63%, and 50% for water, food, and land use and special planning. But you can see a range of other sectors that are included in circular economy strategies below 50%, like, for example, biomass, agriculture, mobility, and also forestry. How the cities are working on this are working through several means and tools, like, for example, pilot and experimentation in 76% of the case. There is a wide use of digitalizations, for example, in the way waste is measured in terms of separate collection, in the collection of real-time data, and for service delivery, in the use of sensors and also blockchain. 41% of cities have a dedicated budget. For example, we had this data for American cities like Phoenix, Toronto, and Austin, but also in Australia like Melbourne. 56% of cities are developing capacity building programs and are using so inside and outside the municipalities, and increasingly public procurement is including circular economy related criteria. Next slide, please. So why they are doing that? There are several priorities. In particular, these that you see shared on your screen are the top 3 priorities accordingly to the respondents. First of all, to rethink production and consumption patterns. Second, to improve environmental quality. And then third, to create new business models. If we go to the next slide. How to do that? There are several obstacles to a circular economy transition in cities and regions that you can see projected in this slide. Basically, the main message is that the obstacles are related to governance more than technical solutions. Lack of technical solution comes last when we look at obstacles in terms of major and important obstacles. And one of the most important ones are related to the inadequacy of regulatory frameworks, insufficient financial resources, but also lack of holistic vision. There is still so much to do in terms of moving the narrative of the circular economy only just from waste, and make sure that we are talking about avoiding wasting resources, and this, it is related to different sectors. Moving to the last slide, here we had a sort of self-assessment of the level of advancement towards the transition to the circular economy. We asked the cities and regions to express an opinion of where they think they are vis-a-vis the circular economy transition. And then you can see that the most 53% of respondents find themselves to be newcomers. So cities and regions that are starting now to look at ways to actually achieve this transition, and only 12% of cities responding to the survey are seeing themselves as advanced. And one of the major characteristics is the fact that it's been years they have been developed strategies, a roadmap, and also a monitoring framework. Going to the next slide here, I just want to show very briefly in conclusion of this presentation is that starting from the evaluation of the self-assessment, so just asking to the cities where they think they are in terms of circularities, you can see that there is a disparity in which cities perceive themselves as newcomers, advanced, or in progress. But we didn't really, but what we want to understand is to provide cities a sort of guidance to have a better understanding of these levels of progress. One way that we thought we could do in this case and to support cities and regions is to provide them with 10 dimensions that we summarized in a scoreboard in order for cities to identify whether some key enabling conditions are in place to actually accelerate this transition and to make sure that, for example, the regulatory framework is in place, economic and finance is in place, stakeholders are engaged, and capacity is building up. So we did that while having interaction with a number of stakeholders during the case studies, through our 6 case studies, but also through this survey. We are now piloting this scoreboard using the result of the survey to see whether the self-assessment that I just showed correspond to what we would like to measure. And we are also adding to this checklist, to this measurement checklist for evaluation. What we would like to achieve is to accompany cities and progress, cities and regions in assessing the progress and the gaps, improving policies and tools, but also raising awareness on the circular economy. On the next slide, you can see actually the visualization or possible visualization of this result. When this measurement framework can be put in place, a city will have an idea of where do they stand in terms of achievement of certain dimensions that can help the transition, not only today, so at the baseline scenario in which the cities and regions are carrying out the analysis, but also throughout the years, where they want to get and what are their actions. If we go to the next slide. It is just to conclude that we have identified the 3 main roles for cities and regions to accelerate and the transition towards the circular economy as a promoter, facilitator, and enabler of the circular economy itself. It is important for the cities we have been working with, and so for the experience as a lesson learned of these last 2 years of work, to develop a vision, to start small and go big. There is a lot of experimentation, but this once starting up, it is important also to find the ways to scale this experience up and to rethink the system and learn from failures. All these recommendations are seen in a coordination across the levels of government. Cities and regions cannot do everything on their own, so it is important to involve several levels of government in order to make sure that regulation, financing, and information are shared across levels of government. Just concluding this, reminding that this result will be included in the report on the circular economy in cities and regions by the OECD, and that will be published in September 2020. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Oriana. This complements nicely the very local experiences that we had in the first webinar this morning, zooming on specific cities. So now we're basically taking a step back and diving into the methodology and more cross-cutting messages in terms of what is driving circular economy, what are the framework conditions that need to be in place that you have captured in your checklist, how you can measure together, and this self-assessment 10 building blocks is a very interesting insight moving forward, and what cities actually see as the major obstacles in their transition. There are a few questions for you, Oriana. Maybe I'll ask them now. Maybe I'll pick two. If you can have a quick go at them, and then we'll move to our panel discussion. So there's a first question, which is asking whether you've learned something from the different sectoral hooks that drive the circular economy. You had this PowerPoint with a wide range of sectors. Is there any difference between manufacturing, for instance, and others such as food, beverage, and textile? If you can elaborate a bit on that. And then there's a second question, or at least suggestion, regarding the word cloud that you have presented. What is a bit the profile of respondents? Because someone is asking whether you have considered asking an untrained sample, which is normally very young people like primary school children, for example, that have not been exposed before to the circular economy and may have terms that can help communicate a bit differently around those concepts. So those are the two questions. There may be more, but if you can get started with these, and then we'll bundle others with the panel discussion.
Yes, thank you very much. Very quickly regarding the first questions, the first question on the sectors. We have seen a variety of circular economy initiatives and related projects at city level on food, on building and construction, on textile, but mainly in relation to what can be reused. So we are looking together with cities and region at the perspective of public policies and how basically cities can connect with universities and business to make sure that, as I said, this transition to the circular economy is shared across several stakeholders that share the responsibilities to make it happen. When it comes to food or the building sector, for example, cities and regions are developing specific tools in order to have material passport, and so to make sure that builders are providing information on how materials can be used. They are also, for example, checking empty buildings to prevent new construction and so to save material extraction. Same for food. There is an overall reconsideration of local economy and kilometer zeros and other initiative related to short mile logistics that can be included in this approach. Regarding the question on education and children and primary school, of course, this is one of the things that mostly the citizen, when we interviewed during the case studies, they really feel like it is important to take into account. We didn't, of course, for technical reason, take into account of this aspect in this survey, but this is something that we discussed with cities and will be included in the recommendation on education and capacity building. So for the next generation to be really aware of the circular economy and probably the fact that there will be a total shift from a linear to a circular economy in the future.
Good. Thank you very much, Oriana. Now I turn to the panel discussion that will focus on measuring the circular economy. The objective, as I said in the introduction, is to show two very concrete measurement frameworks, the monitoring framework at the EU level and the new tool that is developed by Ellen MacArthur Foundation for measuring circularity for businesses. I'll introduce the speakers, but just as heads up for both of you, a question that emerged after Oriana's presentation presentation, if you can somehow grasp it in your presentation, when measuring circularity in cities, how do you differentiate good from bad circular economy? Namely, how do we avoid circular washing? I think this is a very relevant question that applies to anybody developing a measurement framework. So I'm now delighted to introduce Arturo de la Fuente, who's Deputy Head of Unit at the European Commission Eurostat. Arturo, you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I hope so. Yes.
Please.
So good afternoon or good morning, good evening, depending where you are based. I'm here in Europe. I'm very happy to be here making this presentation today, and I'm honored to have this invitation from the OECD. Even in these special times with this coronavirus crisis that raises worries in our minds. I want to share with you quickly the experience that we have in the European Commission, and in particular in in Eurostat, about monitoring the circular economy. The work I'm going to present very quickly started in 2015 with an action plan by the European Commission announcing a series of initiatives related to the circular economy. And one of these initiatives was a monitoring framework. And this monitoring framework took some time to set up, and we got started in 2018. Next slide, please. The monitoring framework that we have in the European Union has 4 areas and 10 indicators, plus some sub-indicators, in total 23. And the 4 areas are the ones that you can see here in this slide. On the top left, you have the first area, that is production and consumption. And we have indicators about self-sufficiency inside the EU of critical raw materials needed, for instance, for batteries and for technology. About green public procurement, we have several indicators about waste generation, and we have one about food waste. Then the second area is about waste management, and we have the indicators that you can see on the top right about recycling rates, overall recycling rates, and for several specific waste streams, for plastics, wood, etc., electronics, etc. The third area covered in our monitoring framework is about secondary raw materials, and we have indicators on the bottom left. We have 2 indicators about the contribution of recycled materials to the raw materials demand. One indicator is for the whole country or the EU, and another indicator is for specific materials. And we have a second indicator about trade in recyclable raw materials, so imports and exports. And finally, the fourth area is about competitiveness and innovation, and we have indicators about investments, jobs, and gross value added in the sector of the circular economy, and another one about patents in the sector related to the circular economy. As you can see, these indicators are very much focused on economic and environmental aspects. They are not so much focused on policy actions, but there are some overlaps with the areas that the OECD presented before about, for instance, green public procurement. This facilitates the interpretation of the data in the sense that clearly, if we have higher recycling rates, it's a good sign, or if we have lower food waste, is a good sign. But some of the indicators are not straightforward and require a lot of explanations, a lot of communication, and a lot of interpretation. And some of the indicators that we are most proud of as statisticians, because I am a statistician, sometimes are hard to understand and to communicate. For instance, the indicator 7A and B in this list about contribution of recycled materials to raw materials demand are difficult to communicate. People keep asking, how is this different from our recycling rate? Next slide, please. I want to explain in this one slide some main features of this dashboard or monitoring framework. It was established in a communication of the European Commission that dates from 2018. Here I added the link so that you can find it easily. This means that it was a product, a product that was agreed by the different services of the European Commission. This is very important because it represents the balance that could be achieved at the time in 2018 of the different aspects, economic and environmental aspects and other mainly it was these two at the time, economic and environmental aspects that were considered. It's not a list of indicators that was decided by Eurostat. We were supporting these discussions, and we sort of imposed some requirements about data quality, and we had a clear preference for a limited number of indicators to facilitate interpretation. But the list represents the balance that could be achieved, the consensus that could be achieved. One of the things that were required from this product was that the data should be available already. This meant that we had proportionally more indicators about waste. This is not because we think waste, the circular economy is about waste, or because the waste is the most important topic, but we had a lot of data about waste that could be used. And this is the explanation for this. Most of the data are produced by Eurostat in cooperation with the national statistical offices of the member states of the EU, but there are also some other providers from the research community, the patents office, etc. And as I said, there are two exceptions, two indicators for which data was not available when they were approved, the one on food waste and the one on grid public procurement. However, it was thought that these areas were sufficiently important as to go ahead having indicators about them. As you saw, the indicators are not particularly focused on cities and regions, and there are several reasons for that, and I'm sure you will have many questions about that. Right now, I just want to say a couple of quick things. First, it was a monitoring framework originally designed by the European Commission for the policy making of the European Union, so at supranational level and at level of the member states. This is one thing. Secondly, when looking at the circular economy at local scales, other factors need to be taken into account, which are very important. For instance, in many cases, when we talk about circular economy, the green loop that we are looking at is taking places in different places. So for instance, food can be consumed in the cities, but food is mostly produced in the countryside. If we only look at the food production and consumption in the cities, we get an incomplete picture. The same thing happens with imports and exports. Imports and exports are concepts in principle meant to be applied to countries or perhaps to bigger regional areas like the European Union, not to regions or cities. Normally we don't talk about imports or exports in the cities. And this matters when we think in terms of the circular economy. This type of considerations were an obstacle to go deeper into the cities and the regions. And also another problem was data availability. As I said before, we wanted indicators that were readily available. And for the cities, it's always harder to get enough data. Next slide, please. The monitoring framework is published online in the Eurostat website. It's free of access. Here on the left side, you have a snapshot of the screen in the Eurostat website. And on the right side, you have the monitoring framework as it looks like, a series of indicators with graphs where you can click to get to download tables. We have metadata explanations and so on. You can find this place simply Googling Eurostat circular economy, and you will be landed in the page on the left. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. Now there is a very recent development. The Circular Economy Action Plan by the European Commission from 2015 has been very recently replaced by a new one in 2020. It was issued on 11th March, so 20 days ago. It's very recent. In this new action plan, there is one section about the cities and the regions. And there is one section also about the monitoring progress. And this section about monitoring progress calls for an update, an improvement of the monitoring framework I just presented, and gives us until end of 2021 to do this update. Some of the new things requested is more emphasis on material footprints and focus on critical sectors like constructions, plastics, textiles, electronics. Also to look deeper into design of sustainable products, innovation, value-added change, etc. And the interlinkages with climate neutrality and the zero pollution ambition of the European Union. So how does it link to energy use, greenhouse gas emissions, emissions of pollutants, etc. What are the consequences? Where are the trade-offs, etc. This is an area where we have some ideas and we think we can advance in the next years. Next slide, please. This brings me to the end of my presentation. Here you have my email, and I'm looking forward for your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Arturo. There were actually two specific questions for you, but you've responded to them with completing your presentation. The first one was whether cities can use the EU monitoring framework in self-assessment of progress towards the circular economy. You did flag that the monitoring framework was not targeting cities primarily, but if you wish to add something there. And the second one, linking to the new circular economy action plan and asking whether the EU circular economy monitoring framework will be revised, which you've just introduced to be done by the end of 2021. Do you want to add something maybe about what cities can do concretely with the monitoring framework that you've introduced, if some of it can be inspiring for their very local discussions? Maybe if you take a minute and then we move to the next speaker.
Yes. As I said, our monitoring framework was made for a different purpose, but I think policymakers in cities and regions can find inspiration without attempting to stick to it, to the line, to the letter, but they can identify areas which are considered relevant for the circular economy by us, and where they can reflect, how could I make a difference in this area? How can I progress it? If I don't have the statistics that the European Union has for the whole EU, what can I measure in my city with the administrative sources I have available, or with the possibilities I have available, or with the big data possibilities, or with the company, the electricity company that supplies electricity to my city? What can I do with this company? So I think it could be a source for inspiration, more than for applied straightforward application.
No, that's great. And so here is a subsidiary one for you, probably deserving a short response to. The action plan mentions exploring setting targets following the One Planet approach, and the European Environment Agency is conducting studies to explore how to allocate a fair budget for Europe. Is this something that might also affect the monitoring framework, according to you?
Yes, I cannot exclude that. I have no information about it yet because it's very recent, but there is always a sort of chicken and egg problem with monitoring frameworks and with targets. Is what goes first, the target or the indicator? And there is a sort of series of iterations going on. So I'm sure we will be in this discussion in the next months.
Very good. Thank you. A few more questions, but we'll keep this for when we open the floor. I'm now delighted to introduce our next panel representative, Ashima Shukdev. You're the lead for Government and Cities program in the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. If you can take us through your measurement framework, please.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. It's really great to be here with you this afternoon. So just to quickly, as a recap, explain who the Ellen MacArthur Foundation are. We were founded back in 2010 with the mission to accelerate the transition to the circular economy. We operate currently across Europe, North America, Latin America, and China, working with businesses, governments, and academia. As Aziza mentioned, I work in our institutions, governments, and cities team, where we're working with the public sector and all things circular economy. And in absolutely all of the work that I've been doing and many of my colleagues have been doing, once people understand what the circular economy is, the immediate question they have for us is, how do we measure our progress towards the circular economy? So to that end, it's been really great to follow the work, of course, of Eurostat and then Oriana and her team, on trying to answer that question and building and developing frameworks around the circular economy measurement. So next slide, please. So I have been asked today to just share an update on one of our latest tools for measuring a circular economy, which is called Circularity. Circularity itself is a company level measurement tool for circular economy performance. That we launched just earlier this year in January 2020. So while this is a tool specifically aimed at companies, there's certainly ways that we'll talk about a bit later on how the company level insights can be useful at a more macro level as well. Next slide, please. So this tool is designed to help an individual company understand, firstly, where they are today in terms of circular economy, and then secondly, what a more circular business might look like for them, and where they are sort of in between those two stages. So while we launched this tool just 3 months ago, it is obviously sort of building on work that we've been doing over the last 5 years on material and product level circularity measurement. It is free to use for all companies. And since launching just a few months ago, we've actually had almost 500 companies sign up. More than 100 of those are companies with an annual revenue of greater than $1 billion US. So we obviously knew there was a lot of demand for a measurement tool from companies, but this take up has really validated that need. Next slide, please. So you're probably wondering, how exactly does the tool work and what exactly is it measuring? I'll just spend a few minutes now kind of explaining the methodology and some of the factors involved. So firstly, the tool is used by companies. They are asked to self-report by completing a questionnaire that provides information to us on the extent to which that company has adopted circularity across its entire operations. There's two main categories of activity that we're looking at in this tool. The first is enablers and the second is outcomes. So when we're talking about enablers, this is looking at the things that company is doing to gear up and enable their transition. So whether that's developing a circular economy strategy, including it in their existing strategies, hiring the right people and training up their people to work on the topic of circular economy, investing in infrastructure and systems that encourage circularity, including circular economy in their innovation processes, engaging with external stakeholders. So you might see this kind of category of enablers as sort of the softer side of how a company might be adopting circular economy, really laying the foundations for the future. The second category that we look at is outcomes. So the real life results of circularity, of their circularity efforts at the company level. So what are the inputs to that company? So what are the materials that they're using? What kind of energy are they using? What percentage of the what's being used by the company is virgin materials versus non-virgin, etc. And then secondly, the outputs that company is producing, are the products and services circular in some way, shape, or form? So can the products that they are developing be repaired? How are they set up for remanufacturing and so on? So these are the two main categories of activity that the questionnaire, that the tool analyzes. Next slide, please. These, the information that we gather from the company is then analyzed and weighted, and really eventually leads to an overall score for that company from A+ to E, and that is accompanied by a specific scorecard for that company. The scorecard provides that overall score, but then also a specific score for the 7 themes that you see listed on the slide. So how are they doing with strategy and planning, people and skills, systems, processes, innovation, external engagement, and then inputs and outputs. In some cases, we also include a specific analyst commentary by our team itself. So looking at where they seem to be falling behind or what they seem to be doing exceptionally well. Eventually, we also want to be including industry benchmarks in this tool. So if you are a company in fashion industry, you will also receive information, anonymized information on how the industry overall is doing towards the circular economy. Next slide, please. So it's only been a few months of companies submitting their scores and using the tool, but we have received some great feedback from companies that are using this. Firstly, I think there's a lot of indications that this is the widest set of indicators that are currently available for measuring circularity at the whole company level. So not just looking at the products and materials, but also looking at things like strategy and staff and skills. And I think at this stage of where we are with businesses, it is important to be measuring those enablers and enabling factors rather than just what's going on specifically with their materials. We've also heard from companies that the scorecard itself and even just the process of answering the questionnaire has been really useful to them in identifying their strengths and weaknesses. So if they notice that in a specific part of the questionnaire, they actually have nothing to say about the way that they're training their staff on circular economy, it gives them an indication of what they should be doing. So it sort of helps share that best practice. And then lastly, the piece of feedback we've received is that these scorecards, some businesses are starting to publish them publicly, and that is giving transparency to key stakeholders around what that company is doing on circular economy and how they're performing. So that is just a quick summary of the Circulytics tool and how it's been used so far. Again, it's just been a few months since we released this tool. We are absolutely planning each year to continue updating the indicators based on inputs and feedback we receive and to refine the methodology further. But I think there's huge potential here in terms of gathering that information and data to do effective benchmarking at the sector level. And then perhaps there's also other points that we can explore in terms of if in a specific city or a country, we see a lot of companies reporting on Circulytics, there could be ways to extrapolate that data to the local or national level. So again, this is the beginning of the journey, but lots of potential for future development. So next slide. Just to say thank you for letting us share this new tool with all of you, and looking forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Ashima, from Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and I'm sure this will trigger a lot of curiosity in the Q&A that we will open right now. Thank you both for sharing those very concrete examples of monitoring frameworks. We'll now pause a bit for a 10-minute window to take some additional questions from the audience. Before that, and to warm up participants, we have a little poll for you that you will see appear on the screen. We need everybody's contribution. With your keyboards, you have 3 questions. Please have a look. The first one is, do you have a monitoring framework for circular economy in your city, region, or country? We have yes, no, but I'm not sure how you click. Yes, we see real time the information, so please click on yes or no. Second question, what are the key dimensions to measure circularity? You have multiple responses here: natural flows, financing, governance. And then the third question, what can measurement help you do? Design and improve a strategy, raise awareness, improve the enabling conditions. We will give you a few more seconds to input to make sure the 200 plus, I think it's almost 230 participants online have a chance. We see from the first question that the majority actually do not count with a monitoring framework at the local, regional, or national level. This is one of the overarching messages that has come out of the survey as well. I think that clearly shows the knowledge gap and the value added of any attempt to provide for a monitoring framework. We see quite a focus on natural flows, governance, but also some interest in financing in terms of the framework conditions, key dimensions to measure, and indeed some expectation that measurement should help as a means to an end to design and improve strategies, but also be used as an awareness raising tool and to improve the enabling conditions. This is great. Thank you all very much for contributing to the poll. I hope that provides some food for thoughts. We can maybe end the poll now, Ender. So we have the fixed results, very good in red, and that's something we can share probably in the takeaway messages from the webinar with the participants. Let me now go back to some of the questions that came out, and please continue to raise your questions via the chat. I'll get the speakers going. Meanwhile, I have myself named, listed a few. There are actually some for you. Arturo, maybe we start with you. There's one question on whether social measures were considered for the framework. If you've seen any other circular economy monitoring or measurement system that includes social measures. And there's also a question on the alignment efforts that exist between the EU circular economy monitoring framework and the UN 2030 agenda. Would you like maybe to get started with these two? And then I have a few ones for Ashima. Arturo, maybe you're on mute.
Yes. Okay.
Yes,
now
please.
it
Now
works.
you can go.
So social measures. The monitoring framework I presented is the one that dates from 2018, which was very much balanced between economic and environmental aspects. And it shows the monitoring, the list of indicators shows this balance. The new action plan that I said dates from 3 weeks ago is much more holistic, and it includes different aspects, and social aspects is one of them. So there is an increasing concern about social aspects and about other aspects that were not covered in the original action plan. So I think with the update of the monitoring framework, we will also have to look at these aspects, but not yet. This is for the future, not for the present.
Mm-hmm.
About the second question about alignment with the UN agenda and SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. In the unit where I work in Eurostat, we also produce statistics for SDGs. So we are the same people wearing two hats. So the alignment is in the people, certainly, but it's not that simple because there are different groups of interest, different policy needs that need to be addressed. So in Eurostat, in my unit, we are working hard to align and to get synergies between different monitoring frameworks. Also because it's in the advantage of statisticians to be more efficient, to get more return for our work, to produce numbers. But clearly, everything that it relates to the UN agenda requires an extra level of coordination at world level. It's not only the EU. And things require more debate, more discussion, more consensus growing. But we are working in that direction, certainly. Having said that, SDGs is much broader than circular economy. It covers many other aspects that cannot be covered in the circular economy, of course.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Arturo. And to add there, basically also that from the OECD standpoint, we have invested quite significantly in the localization of the Sustainable Development Goals and pushed somehow the statistical frontier in measuring where cities and regions stand for many of the goals where they have core prerogatives, including SDG 12 about responsible consumption and production. There are probably some metrics that you can find in our online tool on measuring distance of cities and regions to the SDGs that we hope can be enlightening. I have a question for you, Ashima. How can we convince business but also people and politicians of the necessity of the circular transition in post-COVID-19 times, how to frame the narrative from economic misery to a future of circular opportunity? I mean, you've been exposed and acquainted to many business stakeholders with this measurement framework and in your daily work. Where do you see the way forward in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. We have definitely been thinking about that very question internally. And so given that all of this is still relatively new, we don't have the final answer quite yet, but I think most people do recognize, and a lot of the businesses we're speaking to do recognize that after we recover and emerge from the COVID crisis, things need to change. And the way that they do business is already changing immediately, with people moving more towards online and digital and delivery and so on. So there's sort of this very immediate realization that we're going to have to change the way that we're doing businesses, whether that's responding to consumer needs or the sort of global context. I think the one possible way to position this is that circular economy generally can increase the resilience of an economy, can increase the resilience of the city. So that is messaging we've been using already before all of this. So I think continuing along those lines and encouraging people to realize that the circular economy can support economic development without pushing us away, pushing us beyond our planetary boundaries. The circular economy can regenerate communities. The circular economy can support resilience. I think those are sort of some of the messages that we'll see emerging, and the immediate responses we've had from business as well.
Maybe one more for you, Ashima, asking whether you are at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation aiming to broaden the scope of this tool to cities and regions level, and what's the reason for focusing on companies? Maybe you're on mute, Ashima.
There you go, sorry.
Yes, please.
So we started with businesses because we'd already been doing a lot of work on the sort of measuring circularity at the product level. We'd received a lot of demand from the companies in our network for a broader company level measurement tool. So that was sort of our starting point. We also know that there was a lot of other existing efforts going on to measure circularity within cities and regions by the OECD, for example, with the UN, with the European Commission. So we thought it would be better to focus on companies initially. I think at this stage we have, at least in the next year or so, we're not planning to kind of turn this into a whole different tool that would measure cities circularity at cities and regions, but we're interested in seeing, monitoring what other organizations are doing, seeing how this can be complementary to the work that they're working on, and seeing if cities and regions find this tool useful. So maybe, as I mentioned earlier, if a city wants SMEs in their city to measure their individual companies' circularity, Circulytics is a very useful tool for that. And then they can have some aggregated data on what different companies in their specific region are doing. So I think there's some potential to explore complementarity.
Good, thank you very much. I'm aware we're slightly behind schedule. I'll just raise two more. One for you, Arturo, on behalf of the Committee of Regions Rapporteur. How satisfied should cities and regions feel with the Chapter 5 dedicated to cities and regions within the new Circular Economy Action Plan? We feel that CEAP did not value enough the potential of cities and regions. So that's a question asking for your views. And then Ashima, one final to you. Any comment on how these models and policies translate to large cities of developing countries like India, given their weak municipal capabilities, vested interests and political pressure, and to small towns in developing countries which don't necessarily have the funds or technical expertise? So very brief responses, Arturo, Ashima, and then we move to the final part.
Yes, satisfaction about this chapter in the new Circular Economy Action Plan. Well, it's a very short section, it's 1 page. So I can understand the disappointment by some. I can also say that the section on the measurement is even shorter. So, and I know, but yes, really, I think this is an area where we need to work more, but perhaps the fact that it's a short section also reflects the status quo. We need to advance more in our understanding of how the cities and the regions can help and support this initiative, and the other way around, how the initiative can support and help the cities, so that we have longer chapters in policymaking documents that say more explicitly, where can we focus our energy?
Ashima? Maybe you're on mute.
There you go. Sorry, I
Yes.
can't unmute myself. So in terms of the question of how some of these frameworks apply to larger cities in developing countries or smaller towns, I think that the big question there is what data is available in these different contexts. Often in the developing context, there is a significant lack of data because due to the informal economy or simply infrastructure and systems not being set up appropriately. So I think if there is that lack of data, there is in both the OECD's framework that's been presented and in Circulytics, there are options to still report on some aspects of circular economy. So whether that's the city of Mumbai, for example, could still report that, yes, we have a circular economy strategy in place, or we have such and such governance elements in place that mean that we are moving towards a circular economy. So the fact that these indicators are quite varied and they're not just looking at sort of material flow analysis, I think supports both smaller towns and larger cities where there might not be all of the material flow analysis data available. So I think there are ways that these tools can still be helpful for them.
Good, thank you very much, Ashima and Arturo. There are a few more questions, but we'll convey them to you with the names of those asking them so that you can continue the conversation. Oriana, there are a few questions for you as well, but I would invite cities that want to engage in the policy dialogues to get in touch with Oriana directly. There are a number of them that are asking what are the criteria for selection, whether it's free or not, what does it take for the city. So I think you have a few potential champions out there, but I would suggest that they liaise with you bilaterally. Now we're moving to the last part of the webinar to learn from a very distinguished set of speakers. Some of them are really fathers in the field of circular economy to react on what they've heard and convey some of the messages that they feel is important in this strive to measure and assess the effectiveness and outcomes of circular economy and latest developments that were shared by the panel discussion. So it's my pleasure to introduce first Mr. Walter Stahel, who's the founder, director of Product Life Institute in Geneva, Switzerland, a father of the circular economy, an old friend of the OECD. We've collaborated on several environmental and sustainable development issues. You've been very influential in this area, especially by advocating for service life extension of goods. Your consultancy is now devoted to these sustainable strategies and policies after having received many recognitions and the prize-winning paper, The Product Life Factor in 1982. Sir, you have the floor. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Aziza. I'll answer the three questions. Measuring circularity. The circular economy is about economics, innovation, competitiveness. It maximizes the use value of stocks, natural, human, cultural, financial, manufactured capitals. In the circular economy, wealth is the sum of the quality and quantity of these stocks, but we don't measure it. There is the World Bank Group has a annual or biannual report, The Changing Wealth of Nations, the last one 2018, Building a Sustainable Future. But we lack this kind of overall wealth measure for cities and regions. The second question, what are the key dimensions to measure circularity? People live, they are born, they live and they die. But the key dimension is life. The quality of life, shared responsibility, well-being. Products is the same thing. Products are produced and disposed of. But the whole, as you have seen in the previous presentations, the whole focus is on production and waste management. For God's sake, the thing in between the use is the thing that is of importance. and that we should optimize an intelligent use of goods. And that includes fighting planned obsolescence, ease of repair, right of repair. So many things that we never hardly discuss. We have to improve the intelligent use of goods and not be hypnotized by production and waste. The third question, what can measurement help you to do? It can help you to identify chances to increase the resilience to better manage uncertainty. Some cities, I think about 500, are part of the Resilient Cities initiative of the Rockefeller Foundation in New York. But resilience is really, as we have seen now also with the Corona crisis, with the present throughput linear industrial economy has no resilience. The whole thing collapses if, for example, we raise borders or we stop flying. Then it can identify chances to increase the capability of people to contribute to a circular society through education, vocational training, spreading the knowledge of the circular economy. Because in most schools, this is not really a priority. And finally, identify the chances to close the loops. For example, the invisible liability loop by returning products made of synthetic materials, plastics, and metal alloys to their producer. It's not up to the municipalities to develop strategies, technologies, how to get rid of this. Simply return it to the producer. So in a town, circularity measurement should be what percentage of products that are sold can be reduced to the producer. It should be 100% if you want to be sustainable. Then single use of agricultural produce, you can exploit natural circularity because natural produce simply decompose. A special case is the unavoidable single use goods made of plastics, such as contaminated hospital waste. And we have huge quantities in China's warehouses full with this stuff. So we have to incinerate these things, but then we have to harvest electricity and heat. So in some cases, we cannot avoid single-use plastic, but we have to avoid that it ends up in the environment. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your insights on the Paul's questions and Mr. Walter Stahel for your time with us today. Let me now move to the second discussant. It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. David McGinty, Global Director of PACE. You're the Global Director of the Platform for Accelerating the Circular Economy, PACE, an initiative to drive public-private action and collaboration in this field. You work and you bring together government, business, civil society to design and scale innovative models for circularity, to leverage global leadership and capture and disseminate lessons to achieve scale. Looks like we are doing pretty much the same on that front, and we've been really delighted to count you in the partnerships with stakeholders in this topic. Sir, you have the floor, David.
Great, thanks. I've really enjoyed the discussion today, and I think all my comments will reflect a little bit of a mix of the discussion talking about what's new and emerging with the metrics. And so for us at PACE, we bring together different partners. We don't necessarily have a point of view ourselves. The point is identifying critical issues that require action, whether those are areas where there's blockages, barriers, or either opportunities that aren't being fully exploited in a good way and need to happen so that we can move from the current scale of adoption of circularity to a much larger global scale quickly. And from that viewpoint, one of the things that we do is we do convene a coalition of different groups working on metrics, including Ellen MacArthur Foundation, WBCSD, Circle Economy, et cetera, the European Union and others, on looking at different industry-related metrics, government metrics, et cetera, and trying to find areas where those can harmonize to enable, kind of create channels for scaling, as well as to advise one another to see if there are opportunities where there's, for example, data gaps or systems that are missing. So that maybe just a few reflections on, I would say, one, there is an emerging, rapidly increasing movement in developing regional and national groups and clusters. So that would be with government. So for example, you'll see an alliance of ministers of environment on circularity in Latin America now, Africa, some groups bubbling up in Southeast Asia or Asia Pacific, but also the civil society groups like the African Circular Economy Alliance. There's alliances at regional and sub-regional levels in Latin America as well, and even national alliances, sometimes the hotspots they're referred to. So those are happening, but then there's also some little interesting groups that don't quite fit. So with the US Chamber of Commerce, for example, they've been doing an assessment of the Great Lakes region in the US. So not a country necessarily known for federal government leadership and circularity, but within an industry group, they're looking at a region to see if certain industries made a transition, what would it mean? What would they want to measure? And what could it look like for economic development in that region? And they're looking across the US and Canadian border in the region. So I think there's some really interesting opportunities to look at when you look at economic regions, not just geographic regions for circularity. Just a couple more points on, there are other types of cities level metrics that have been going on. Like if you look at the circular gap report that Circle Economy does, what they've been doing in city reports, and with another advisory firm in the Netherlands, Metabolic, they're using a very similar methodology that looks at material flows. And I would say if you combine the learning of those groups with EMFs and others, one of the powers of metrics is in cities is the ability to inform and mobilize communities to understand what we're talking about. So I've heard all of those groups talk about that. They might go in with a certain initiative, but it's actually the education component, the mobilization that becomes the real value of the metrics work, or immediate value. So a little reflection on what's coming. This is partially what I feel needs to be done and also what is happening, and to support some of the comments throughout the day on the Circular Economy Action Plan coming out from the Commission, that there is, if you see peeking its head up today, a certain action, you can always know that the church of believers here on this call, there's another wave of more progressive action coming behind it. And where I would like to support is, one, I'm seeing a significant shift to more systems thinking. So we might see in the action plan, I talk about circular cars, vehicles, but really beginning to think about mobility and what circular mobility looks like. A shift from housing to then thinking about utilization and efficient use of infrastructure. And a move from thinking about, say, food waste and loss, or kind of SDG 12.3, to looking at what does circularity mean for food land systems in general. And on the corporate side, you see a shifting trend from looking at individual companies, that's what's peeking its head up right now, towards looking at industries and what industries need to do to make themselves more circular. And then just a kind of final note here on metrics and what I sometimes talk about as a house of metrics, but you can view it as a stack. So how metrics can layer up. The base information that we get that everybody needs is inflows and outflows. You need to know the material flows. There's no metric or standard I've seen around circularity that doesn't look at that. So that's where there's clear alignment. But it's how you start to build on top of that to link into and begin to mainstream circularity into global initiatives that can unlock significant investment. And I think that's where the community's gotten stuck a little bit. And so within PACE, what we're trying to do is look at how circularity can contribute to existing economic indicators and others at the nation state level, which might feed into cities as well, like net jobs, percentage of GDP that's circular, and how circularity can contribute to specific NDC actions, and there are different programs and actions going on there. And then at the highest level, I would say probably at a political level, there's a need that we're seeing within our community, and a call that we're certainly making and are working on, is what kind of long-term aspirational goal can we set as a community that would be the actual impact that we want to see by the circular transition. So that might be something like, by 2050, can we say if we made a circular transition, we've helped enable a 1 degree contribution to climate change, or we've helped contribute to a certain percentage reduction or gigaton reduction of carbon emissions. And that's the type of global, very simple, singular metric that I think is required for the circular economy. Let's call ourselves a movement, to actually get mainstreamed into the billions and trillions of dollars of investment that will go on, whether it's through responses to COVID or whether it's through investments in things like SDGs.
Thank you very much, David, for these very valuable insights, and the outcome-oriented approach also as a means to enlarge the base of social and political acceptance, and accelerate the efforts through even greater evidence for awareness raising. I think that's very spot on, and actually the raison d'être, if I can say so, of any measurement framework. So thank you very much for those insights, and I will now, last but not least, introduce Mr. Anders Wickman, who's the chair of Climate Kick, one of the largest public-private partnerships on innovation for low-carbon solutions in the EU, honorary president of the Club of Rome, chairman of the Swedish Association of Recycling Industries, former president of Globe EU, and I could go on. You're one of the éminences grises, as we would say in French, in this area. We're very delighted to have you, and also recently contributing to a lot of the OECD work in this field. Mr. Wickman, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, fine. Well, thank you for the invitation. Most interesting, both the session before lunch and now after lunch. Let me start by making two very general comments. Sometimes I think there is a risk that we overrate the opportunities by moving towards a more circular economy. The mere notion of circularity gives people the impression that we can put in place almost perfect material loops, and we cannot. We know that. We always lose quality in the process, and we need a lot of energy to make that happen. So I think we should realize that even if circularity is many times better than the linear production model we have, there are limitations. And I think this is important in the OECD context and among OECD members, because that means also that even when we have achieved circularity, we cannot just continue to increase consumption growth. It's not possible. Given the needs in the developing countries, we have to concentrate our economy much more on well-being and sufficiency rather than continuing to just consume resources. Second comment is that while cities can do a lot, and we have had many good examples today, we also know that there are some barriers to change that we have to look at governments and the European Commission in the European context to solve. Let me mention three of them. One is the cost structure in the economy. I've been active in the recycling industry business for quite some time. And one of the major reasons why markets for secondary materials are relatively limited is simply because virgin materials are cheaper. And as long as this is the case, it's going to be very difficult. So here we need some corrections, and you can use the tax instrument. Why the hell are we taxing labor and not resource use? That's just a question. Secondly, design. I will share with you in a few minutes a study we did in Sweden within the recycling industry, where we tried to look at how much value do we capture after first single use. Even when we recycle, and we came to the conclusion that most of the value is lost today. And that's because of design, because products are designed in a way that it's very difficult to recycle and reuse materials and components. And design requirements have to be put in place by, I think, the European Commission or the European Union. And this has long been overdue. We started to discuss this already in 2004, 2005, under the theme of integrated product policy. Now with the new Commission, it seems as if it's going to happen. And that will be a major, major step forward. Lastly, public procurement, which has been referred to many times today. The directives of public procurement in the European context are okay today. They don't limit procurement officials to put requirements to move in the circularity direction. The problem is the competence among the procurement officials. They simply don't understand these issues. We have to enhance the level of competency through education. Now, those were some general comments. Let me then move specifically into the measurements. And I think we have to start with recognizing that there is no clear definition of what circularity is. So to people, it means many different things. And it is many different things. It's what one of the facets is, of course, doing more with what we have already produced. The vehicle fleet is a good example. Another one is to extend product life. A third is to recondition and refurbish. A fourth is to reuse materials. A fifth is recycling, and so on and so forth. The problem is that we have so many indicators around, and it becomes very difficult to know which of them are of good quality. And here comes the snag. The absolute best example of circularity would be to extend product life, to manage the stocks well, like Walter Stahel said. And we have no indicator for that, which is very, very ironic. Instead, we focus a lot of attention on recycling. And I'm not saying that recycling is not important, but the study we did within Sweden, the recycling industry, was very illustrative. We asked the question, if we put 1,000 euro of plastics or aluminium or steel into the marketplace, how much of that value is still there after first use? And we came to the conclusion, on average, no more than 25%. And for plastics, it was less than 8%. For aluminium, which I thought was going around in loops like this, it was only about 40%. Beer cans, Coca-Cola cans, they circle around. But for many other products, there were very complex composite materials and very, very difficult to recycle and reuse. So design is very, very critical. And recycling rates measured in tons of volumes tell very little about circularity. Because most of what we recycle, at least in the Swedish context, doesn't really end up in a high quality context after the recycling. This doesn't mean that we should not move in this direction and that we shouldn't use indicators, but we have to be mindful of the fact that indicators that are quantitative in nature tell us very little about what's really happening. So I would like to move in the direction of more quality aspects. Then one of the experiences I have as chairman of Climate Kick is that when we look at a system, we don't really have the right indicators. And we need to look at systems. Vertical interventions, single point solutions are of course good, but if we want to change the transportation system in a city, for instance, we need to look at many, many things at the same time. It's not only the fuel or the engine, it's public transport, it's the design of the city, it's the facilities for biking, for walking, etc. To go about that in a systemic way requires, of course, indicators and measurements. And I'm sorry to say we don't have them today, but we are exploring ways to move in that direction. We have presently, within Climate Kick, 15 major European cities involved in a fascinating program under the heading of systemic innovation and change. And one of the challenges there is going to be to develop the right systemic indicators. I don't think we will ever end up, and I will end there, I don't think we will ever end up with one or a few precise indicators. This area is so complex. But I think it would be good if we could agree in the longer term around 5 to 10 composite indicators that will then help us to move in the right direction. It's a very, very fascinating and challenging journey. And I can only hope that all the work that the OECD has been doing is going to help us on that path. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Wickman, for these very insightful contributions. Quite a few questions coming from the web, and I see the clock is ticking and we need to wrap up the webinar, but maybe I'll ask you two very briefly because they're directed to you. The first one is, you said that the directives in place were all fine in terms of procurement for a circular economy. So the question is, what consideration should be given to circular procurement? Do you have any view on that?
Well, already within the present directives, you can demand, you can issue a call for a solution to a certain problem. You don't need to specify a specific product. So there are provisions for a different type of procurement. The problem, as I said, is you have to train people how to do that. But I think it's very important to make that comment that the present directives are, I wouldn't say 100% okay, but relatively okay. Because if we would have to go through a revision of the procurement directives, that would take 3 to 4 years. So I think it's better to use what we have in an intelligent way and to organize training seminars all over Europe for procurement officials.
Thank you. Point taken, focusing on the capacity development issue more than the revamping of the legal frameworks in place. Maybe a second one for a very short answer, please. Speaking about extending lifetime of products, would eco-design not help? And would initiatives of standardization of testing protocol help to qualify this lifetime extension?
Absolutely. I think the eco-design directive is very good, but it has been focused up till now only on energy and energy-related issues, energy efficiency. As a matter of fact, in 2004, in the debate we had in the European Parliament, I was then a member, we had discussions around broadening the eco-design directive to take in materials and products more fully. And I made that suggestion. And then the then industrial commissioner, very powerful German, Mr. Verheugen, he looked at me and he said in German, "Aber Herr Wickman, das ist doch Kommunismus." So we have come a long way to moving towards a point where we really discuss what kind of products should there be. And I think the Eco-Design Directive will and should be a very important instrument in this regard. And I can see that many big companies are asking for that. IKEA is one example.
Good. Thank you very much, and many thanks to all the speakers for their very concise and precise contributions. Oriana, Arturo, Ashima, but also Walter, David, and Anders as discussants. Really my pleasure to bring this webinar to an end. I will hand over the floor now to Oriana for some takeaways and an indication of the next step. Oriana, who's, as I said in the introduction, the mastermind, the architect of this OECD work on circular economy in cities and regions. We're very proud of the reports launched today and many more to come. Oriana, you have the final word, and big thanks to you and your team for the great work.
Thank you, Aziza. Thank you, everybody, for these amazing contributions. I think that this morning and this afternoon, we had an example of how organizations, individuals, and people are really much studying this subject. As we said repeatedly, the circular economy is not a new thing, but still we need to build knowledge. We need to raise awareness, give clear information, let people, organization, business, citizen understand what the circular economy is and what the benefit will be, taking into account, as Anders Wickman was just saying, all the limitation of this system, of course. I think just to really wrap up on the latest discussion that we have, there is an important thing to keep into account, that measurement and all the challenges related to measurement comes to the fact that there is not just a one agreed upon definition of the circular economy. This is a very complex and challenging we are talking about economic systems. So this is not just measurable as such, but we need to understand, as David was actually mentioning in his intervention, how to have an understanding of this shift from housing to using, from owning to sharing, from different kinds of way we conceive producing and consuming food and materials for our buildings. So once we have clarified also through what we are doing at the OECD, how cities and regions can contribute to these transitions, and what beyond what to do, also how can they do so. And so looking at the governance dimension in the way that I've tried to explain through the work of the scoreboard, so as a self-assessment of the governance conditions in place, then we can keep going with this debate, which is not only related to the downstream activities of waste, of recycling, of making sure that products are reused once used, but we also have to take into account all that there is upstream. So what Ander was mentioning, the design, and what Walter Stahl was mentioning, how to prevent that actually resources are wasted, and so enable this circularity overall. As for the next steps, first of all, you will find in a few days the materials available on the website, the presentations. We will arrange also the registration of the webinars, if this would be possible from a technical point of view, and then, as the OECD program will go ahead with the 3 case studies that they were mentioning this morning from the UK, from Ireland and Spain, and the overall synthesis report will be published in September. If you have any further questions, doubt, or if you want to talk to us as a circular economy team within this OECD program, please don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you, Aziza. I will leave the floor to you just to close the webinar, and thank you very much for the attention and your participation in the webinar today. Thanks.
Thank you, Oriana, and thank you all. We can now end the meeting. I'd like to thank our IT colleagues at the OECD. You were fantastic. You did magics this morning and this afternoon. Thank you very much for helping us keep the conversation going. I hope all of you, panelists, speakers, and participants are coping well in this peculiar, unprecedented time with COVID-19, and your families and relatives are doing well as well, and we'll be in touch by email with all the follow-up information, and look forward to many more cities, regions, and stakeholders joining the program. Thank you very much, and have a nice end of the day.